Welcome to the session, Including Disability in DEI Efforts in Philanthropy. I'm Lauren Kotkin, the Director of Educational Programs at Exponent Philanthropy. I'm a white woman with brown hair and glasses wearing a brown shirt. I want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank Nations. We're looking forward to our conversation today with Ryan Easterly, Nikki Brown Booker, and Jesse Galloway. Their bios are underneath this viewing window. All three speakers are also in the chat, so as you have questions or would like to continue a conversation you hear today, please share your thoughts in the chat. And the speakers will also be available this afternoon via video for the after chat. We're going to start with a brief video from the President's Council on Disability Inclusion in Philanthropy, and then afterward, the panelists will join us on screen, and the conversation will be moderated by Jesse Galloway of Ability Central Philanthropy. And now the video, Living Your Values.
A series of interviews.
My name is Dessa Cosma. I'm a little person who often uses a wheelchair. Disability communities have so much to offer. You know, we're used to improvising and adapting and being creative because we have to be to survive. And so much of that is about not living in a society that was thinking about us or only thought of us as an afterthought, and not being able, as a result, to find adequate housing, transportation, education, jobs, social groups.
My name is Ryan Easterly. I am a Black man with a teal and white striped shirt wearing glasses. The ADA is great, but the real work, the real challenge is overcoming those attitudinal barriers to get people to see me for me, everything I bring to the table, and not just the disability.
My name is Alice Wald, and I'm wearing a mask attached to a tube that's used to help me breathe. I really do believe that grant makers, foundations do have a role in showing what diversity is. A lot of people don't associate disability with diversity, and they absolutely should, because people with disabilities are present in every diverse community. That would be my challenge to you, is to really seek out people with disabilities and prepare to be uncomfortable. I think that's something that we all have to do, to really open our minds and to really be able to see outside of ourselves.
My name is Maddie Rubelo. I am a young white woman with brown curly hair. I have a chronic illness called POTS. Inclusion is not just funding disability rights organizations, although obviously that is incredibly important. It's also making sure that there are disabled people within your own organizations.
My name is Rebecca Coakley. I am wearing a Prince purple dress because I'm a huge Prince fan, and wearing a jacket that's designed by Kathy Woods, who is the first little person fashion designer in the country. Here would be a couple of my suggestions for funders about how to live your values. Hiring people with disabilities in roles that are not just disability specific. Hiring people with disabilities in your HR spots, in your women's bureaus, in your logistics team, on your communications side, across the board. How that changes things. How just simple engagement changes the stigma that people have around disability rights.
My name is Carrie Gray. I am a young adult Black woman sitting in a chair. On my right leg is a prosthetic limb, and I am wearing a red romper with a black head wrap. If you're trying to build practices around people with disabilities, then you should definitely have people with disabilities in the room making decisions with you. We found it extremely helpful to work directly with recruiters, with supervisors, with hiring managers, and having conversations of what does it mean to create inclusive hiring practices, and what does it mean to be the type of supervisor where you can have these type of conversations with your employees about, I need an accommodation, I need to talk to you about that. Will this impact the way in which you see me and the way in which I can perform my job? These are kind of the standard conversations that unfortunately we're not having nearly enough of, if at all.
previous interviewees Dessa Cosma, Maddie Ruvalo, and Ryan Easterly speak consecutively.
If we actually reorient our society to be good for people with disabilities, every single person benefits. If we were to really radically change our culture to be inclusive of people who need a totally flexible work schedule, parents would have a better time, people caring for elderly parents would have a better time, people could actually have a better balance in their life.
And when we accept that people who are disabled are doing things differently, and that in fact everybody can do things differently, it really is more freeing for everybody.
To see each other for everything we are, all of our struggles, all of our successes, and the little nuances that we all have, regardless of whether or not we identify as having a disability.
Where are you in your journey to inclusion? For more information, go to disabilityphilanthropy.org and promote using the hashtag #DisabilityInclusion. Brought to you by the President's Council on Disability Inclusion in Philanthropy. Text on screen of the production credits. For a full credit list, please review the transcript file.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jessie Galloway. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a white woman with short curly red hair, wearing glasses and a blue polka dot button-down shirt. I want to acknowledge the land that I occupy, the unceded lands of the Hopewell and Kaskaskia peoples. I want to honor the resiliency of these tribal nations and recognize the historical contexts that have and continue to affect the indigenous peoples of this land. I'm thrilled to be here today to moderate this important discussion as we share why a disability lens matters in grant making and how it can strengthen philanthropy. I'm joined today by Nikki Brown Booker of the Disability Inclusion Fund, which is administered by Borealis Philanthropy, and Ryan Easterly of the WITH Foundation. To start, would each of you briefly discuss your work, funding priorities, and why you do this work? Nikki, would you start us off?
Sure, thanks, Jessie. So I'm Nikki, my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a brown-skinned woman with short curly hair, wearing glasses, and I have on a blue shirt and a white sweater over the top. And I am on unceded Ohlone Chochenyo territory, also known as Oakland, California. So the DIF has the Disability Inclusion Fund. Our funding priorities, we really wanted to work towards both short-term and long-term change. And so in our immediate future, the fund is really centering on philanthropy and how it can help people with disabilities who are advocating for disability justice. We have several kind of guiding principles that we really follow in our grant making. We're very much focused on being led by people with disabilities and having participation of people with disabilities to kind of focus our grant making. And we also want to see a significant increase in support going towards disability justice and organizations led by people with disabilities. We've already finished our first round of grant making, and we really focus on really doing field building activities and really growing the capacity of disability-led organizations. And we also really are being intentional about educating funders about the issues facing people with disabilities, so that that's kind of one of our long range goals of also supporting funders to take meaningful steps towards full inclusion of people with disabilities at their own institutions. And just all of this is really moving towards including a disability lens in all practices and philanthropy. And that's really kind of like why I do this work. I personally came from a perspective of being part of the community and being an advocate, and formerly working for nonprofits, and really seeing the other side of the coin, and knowing that the struggle to get funding and for philanthropy to really understand the disability community was always a challenge. So being part of the fund is really giving me the opportunity to kind of shift that narrative.
Well, I will go next, and I want to start by thanking you, Jesse and Nikki, for your time today. I enjoy any time I get to spend with y'all, so thank you for your time today. I'm Ryan Easterly. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a Black man with disabilities, and I'm wearing a purple button-up dress shirt, and I have Black hair and Black glasses. I come to you today from the land of the Rasmatush Awani people, which is now known as Redwood City, California. Ultimately, the WITH Foundation is dedicated to promoting comprehensive healthcare for adults with developmental disabilities in the US. And when I say developmental disabilities, I mean disabilities that their onset occurs before the age of 22, and they are developmental in nature. So really, we look at supporting comprehensive service delivery models. We also support cultural competency and cultural humility trainings for medical professionals. We look at supporting the use of supported decision-making within healthcare settings, and look at supporting especially national efforts related to including the perspectives and experiences of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the development of digital healthcare technology, as well as looking at efforts that identify and help adults with developmental disabilities overcome the barriers they face when accessing high quality healthcare. And I think for me, what brings me to this work, as someone who's multi-marginalized, meaning that I identify as a Black gay man with disabilities who was raised in the South and spent some time in the foster care system, I appreciate the opportunity to bring my lived experience to bear in shaping the funding that I've had the privilege of being involved with, as well as support other individuals, especially who are multi-marginalized, in bringing their lived experience and their expertise to shape other funding. So I have to admit, my first job in philanthropy, I really didn't understand that the job was to give money away. But I think once I fully grasped that over a decade ago, there's not been much looking back, and I've done all I can to support others, especially people of color, in bringing their experience to bear in philanthropy. I would say, in terms of my work with Foundation, I'm a firm believer that all individuals have the right to healthcare. And when receiving healthcare services, they have the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And I think, especially as an individual with disabilities, I believe that if you can get the appropriate healthcare, you can go on to do many other meaningful things in your life. But it's important that all individuals get the appropriate healthcare to support them in doing the other things they want to do. So that's me and my journey. Jesse, from your perspective, I have the privilege of knowing you and getting to work with you more and partner in some of your work. Could you tell the attendees a little bit more about yourself and about your work?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Ryan. I want to echo that I'm very happy to be here with both of you. And yeah, let's see. Ability Central Philanthropy is a foundation that improves communication and information access for people with disabilities through grant making. We also do some grantee education and other funder education. For me, as a person with disabilities, but also as a sister with disabilities, I'm passionate about working in philanthropy to direct funds that support access for our communities. And everyone can communicate, and self-expression is so vital. So seeing the impact our work has given me hope that our future can be accessible. And one moment that stands out for me, this was really life-changing for me about the work that we do. I was on a site visit, and I was in a day center. The television was really loud. It was playing baseball. It was the World Series. And our grantee, CTEC, which is a part of the Supported Life Institute out of Sacramento, was outfitting custom key guards for the screens of speech generating devices for folks that needed the surface area to touch the buttons to be bigger for accuracy. And I watched as the grantee outfitted his client, we'll change his name, but let's say Owen, that he turned 40 years old the day before. The cake was still on the table. He got the client outfitted, and that's when we all heard Owen speak his first sentence. And he typed, "I don't like baseball." And all I could imagine was like how long he'd wanted to say, "Turn the damn channel." But that was profound for me. And, communication is so vital. And I think the work that we do has just really given me different perspectives. And our funding priorities have included training assistive technology and augmentative and alternative communication professionals. And we hope always for a sustainable project that does more train the trainer, or now we're doing a lot of funding a lot of hybrid things where people are doing some online work that's having a bigger reach. And then research and innovation, which takes many, many forms, whether it's actually a device for people with disabilities or some of the research. One of my favorite projects is one that's working with stroke patients who have aphasia. And they're seeing positive results by doing transcranial direct stimulation at the same time as speech language pathology, and people are regaining their speech. We do networking and collaboration. We used to call it replicating successful models. And then we, in the last 2 years, have been doing capacity building grants as well. I think that's us in short. I'll not take up too much more time. I think I got excited about our grantees there for a minute. Let's see, let's shift over to the next question here. When considering our work, though we all have different missions and priorities, we share a commitment to having people with lived experience of disability, both making and shaping our funding decisions. Could you each share, excuse me, more information on how you involve community voices in your funding decisions? Ryan.
I think in WIS's case, our roots are as a family foundation. In terms of my involvement with the WIS Foundation, I first came in contact with them as joining the board in one of those community member slots. So we are very fortunate in the case of this particular family foundation that from the initial establishment of the foundation in 2002, the founding family knew that they wanted to give in the disability space, but they also knew that they lacked the lived experience of disability and wanted to make sure that people with lived experience of disability had a seat at the table and shaped the funding efforts from the outset of the foundation. So I actually came into contact with the foundation in 2015, first as a board member, and then eventually began the process and was appointed executive director in 2017. But the WIS Foundation also includes other individuals with disabilities on our board of directors, as well as on our staff. And we also have a self-advocate advisory committee that advises us on our grant making and our efforts. And with that advisory committee, they're really co-decision makers in our efforts. And currently the committee is 7 individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities from around the country. And when talking specifically about the advisory committee, I always like to point out that with our advisory committee, they are compensated for their time and expertise. One of the core values of With Foundation in both our funding and in our operations is we want to make sure that people with disabilities are fairly compensated for their time and expertise. So often we see with multi-marginalized individuals, they may be given an opportunity to shape the funding and to shape efforts, but they're not always compensated equitably for their time. So we try to ensure that both in our operations and in our grants. And also, I think it's particularly important for the disability community that you allow for alternative forms of compensation. So meaning stipends, cash, also gift cards, because people with disabilities and multi-marginalized folks may depend on government programs to live and thrive. And we don't want to ever have someone risk their livelihood in the way they're used to functioning in order to help us better do what we do. So I did want to point that out, but ultimately how we do is what we do is we make sure that in all aspects of our operations, we look to people with disabilities to shape and lead the work.
Nikki?
Sure. I think that we kind of in a similar way that the With Foundation works. We also have we do participatory grant making, and the way that looks at the Disability Inclusion Fund is that we have a committee that we put together that informs our grant making, and that committee is made up of equally of funders and of advocates from the field. So this last year we had 5 advocates and 5 funders, and reviewing applications and really making decisions about who we would want to recommend for funding. So I think that what's unique about our model is that we both have funders and advocates at the table with each other, and I think that that process was is really interesting because it gives funders an opportunity to hear directly from advocates what they think is important. So they are really lending their lived experiences to funders who may not necessarily have had that opportunity to really hear directly from the communities that they're trying to serve. So, and also I think what's interesting about that is also advocates really get to hear, the funder perspective and how they view things and how they're looking at funding. So, it's a pretty interesting model, and I think it's been pretty successful. So in our first year, and we're getting ready to do it again for our second round. But I do think the thing that's so key about doing that participatory model is that, you're really bringing so many different experiences, into the table at one place, and that that people are really listening to each other and kind of learning from each other in that process, which I think has been really important in building out our fund. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
That's great. I'm gonna take a quick drink. Well, very similar to, I think, the With Foundation. In fact, I think we modeled our grant making off of With to some extent. But at Ability Central, we also have an advisory group, and then many members of the board of directors also have disabilities. We created the advisory group to be comprised of individuals with disabilities, and there happens to be one service provider on there as well, direct service provider to people with disabilities. And we host 2 meetings a year. And in the first one, we really get a lot of input on unmet needs in the community, so that can help shape what we're funding for the next year. And then the advisory group also evaluates our grant applications. And then we take their feedback into consideration and ask their questions on the proposals in our applicant calls. We do applicant calls before making final decisions too, or recommendations to the board. And the advisory group members are paid stipends. And yeah, I think I have a lot of things to say that have already been said about, you need to pay your marginalized folks. I think one thing also, I think you should be looking for this in applications too. Like, you should ask yourself if the applicants know what the community needs and how do they? Because making decisions for any community requires the community at the table. All right, well, I'm gonna move on to the next question. Our funding decisions are also informed by the information we receive. Could you both discuss things we should be mindful of when examining our processes? Nikki?
Yeah. Well, I love this. I particularly love this question because when I started, as a funder and started putting together like my RFP process, we were very intentional in making our applications in, multiple accessible formats. So we have a Salesforce portal. We put it in a Google Doc application. We have it available in Word and a PDF. We will also do, video calls or phone calls, and just making the process as accessible as possible so that, organizations with disabilities can access the process. We also provide a webinar that we make it in put in accessible formats. Like, we had captioning in ASL during our webinar that really went through the application process. And when I started this, I didn't think anything of the fact that we were doing this, but after talking to many funders and many, foundations and organizations, and hearing how cutting edge it was to actually offer our applications in multiple formats, I was actually a little shocked by that this was such a new and interesting idea. I think which really speaks to the fact that philanthropy really has a long way in actually kind of serving. If they want to serve people with disabilities, they actually really need to think about how they do that. So that's something that just seemed, an obvious thing to do, but was, but for many, that is not just the way that they operated. So I'm really kind of proud of the fact that we do that. And now I feel like other funders are kind of following our model.
Well, Nikki, from my perspective, I just want to reiterate that to me, it seems like a simple thing, but it really is cutting edge. And I commend you for your leadership of the Disability Inclusion Fund and being so intentional when it comes to that. As far as WIS process, similar to what Jesse alluded to earlier, I'm a big believer that really a lot of the power that we have as funders can come from our ability to shape efforts based off of the questions that we formally ask as part of the process. So when I think about WIS process, we're very intentional about asking how the leaders of an organization, how they identify and the various identities they hold, especially, if they're marginalized, meaning, are they a woman? Are they a person of color? Do they identify as an individual with disabilities? Are they non-binary or hold a trans identity? Are they a veteran? So being very intentional about asking about the leadership of an organization, as well as being intentional about asking When an organization is discussing the communities they impact, do they know if they're impacting the disability community, or do they know if the individuals that they're supporting and impacting hold multiple marginalized identities? And we're very intentional about collecting data around that. Also, when we're evaluating budgets and discussing with potential grantees about their budgets, we make sure to ask questions related to, are you allowing for expenses related to accommodations and access needs? Are you allowing for the materials and different tools that will be developed through the work we're supporting? Will those materials and tools be fully accessible to individuals? So making sure, from a budget perspective, that the funding we're providing allows for those expenses, as well as looking for ways that we can continue to ask questions even in our final report. So we specifically ask, as part of our final report, have you seen any changes in the number of individuals with disabilities that you're serving, or have within your organization, has the representation of the number of people with disabilities that you have on your boards and within your staff, have you experienced any changes? So again, it's embracing our power as a funder to raise questions that can support and help shape the organization's efforts.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thanks, Ryan and Nikki. Sorry. What types of funding do you feel are important to help meet the needs of the disability community and other marginalized communities?
I can talk a little bit about that. I think that, all of our grants are capacity building grants and general operating support grants. We really feel like it's important to really bolster and support organizations to build out their capacity, particularly because most of the organizations we grant to have smaller budgets. We limit our budget size to under 1.5 million. So we're really focusing on smaller grassroots disability justice organizations that often are not the first thought in funders' minds when they're giving out money. So since we're really focusing in on that particular group, we really want to help them build out the capacity of their organizations. And we really feel strongly that in order to do so, that we allow them to use the money for whatever it is that they need. And so by operating like general operating support. Another thing that we've been doing a lot of is really offering them some capacity building consulting, using our funds to, like we recently did a workshop on financial management that all of our grantees were able to attend. We did a workshop on how to develop like your human resources. So really, also supporting them and with really helping them really fully develop their organizations and building out really strong structures within their organizations. So that's kind of one of the things that we really feel strongly about, that we focus our funding on.
Thank you for your efforts, Nikki, and really for all the work you do through the Inclusion Fund. I think from WIS's perspective, I would highlight two different types of funding. The first is doing what you can to make rapid response funding available. Obviously, as a healthcare funder and dealing with COVID and the pandemic response, most of our grantees were directly impacted by COVID and had to reprioritize things to better support the communities and the providers that they serve in meeting the challenges presented by COVID-19. So for the first time in the history of the foundation, we actually issued 2 separate rounds of rapid response funding to our grantees. And in the case of WITH, how did we operationalize this, especially as a small staff foundation? In my case, I was very lucky to have both the support of the board and our advisory committee. So one member of our board, as well as the chair of our advisory committee, assisted in looking at the applications we received for the rapid response funding. And we were very intentional in making the work and labor involved in applying for the response funding to be as minimal as possible. We asked one question, which is, how would you use this additional funding to better support adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities in meeting the challenges of COVID? So it was one question, and I received support from the board and the advisory committee in reaching those decisions. So I would really encourage any foundation to look at the ways that you can provide more rapid funding to meet the challenges that come up as we're doing what we do and people are living their lives. Another thing I think is important to highlight is finding ways to be intentional in supporting BIPOC-led organizations, meaning Black, people of color, Indigenous people-led organizations in general. And I would say, as someone who's a veteran in providing disability inclusive funding, we have an equal importance to make sure that we're being intentional in providing funding to BIPOC-led organizations. Because as we've all touched on, as we all hopefully know, as attendees of this session, people can hold multiple identities. So finding ways to support and being intentional in providing funding specifically to BIPOC-led organizations, I think is important.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Ryan, for it's wonderful. I think we're nearing the end here. What is the one thing you hope those who have joined us today will remember about disability inclusion in philanthropy? I'll go ahead and start. I mean, I think for me, I want everyone to take away that 1 in 4 people have or will have a disability. And this crosses, you know, the identities, it's race, gender, sexuality, I can go on and on, but you cannot exclude people with disabilities in your funding when you are supporting the most marginalized. We're everywhere. And making decisions for the community requires the community at the table. So I urge you to consider who's at your table, making decisions, and for whom. Nikki?
Sure. I echo what you just said. And I think what I would also add is that, you know, like I said, access, like making everything that you do accessible to people with disabilities. You know, it shouldn't be revolutionary that we have our our application process in multiple formats. I think that's one of the biggest things I want other funders to know, and that and also that this is, you know, it's a learning process, and that, you know, as we go along, we know that we need to learn more about and learn from our community, and particularly the disability community, and how we can do this better, how philanthropy can do this better. And I mean, that's why we use a participatory grant making model, and why we fund to like disability led organizations primarily. So just really thinking about access and listening to the community.
And I can only echo everything that Nikki and Jesse have just said. I would only add that if you happen to be a funder or foundation that has ever thought or uttered the phrase when discussing disability that you don't do disability, know that from my perspective, that position, that approach is discriminating, and that you are actively making it harder for individuals with disabilities to exist and live lives where they can thrive and live fully fulfilled lives. So please, if you take nothing else away, know that whatever your specific mission is, you're not doing it effectively if you're not being intentional and including a disability lens into what you're doing. Hopefully you've heard loud and clear, from all of us, disability crosses all forms of identity. So please take the steps to be intentional about including disability. There are a number of disability organizations within your local community that if you reach out, they'll support you in your learning journey. There's also resources and tools available through the Disability and Philanthropy Forum, as well as Exponent Philanthropy has a disability funders peer circle that I'm sure Jesse will talk about as we wrap up. But please know that whatever you're doing, however you're positively impacting your community and the cause that you care about, in order to do it effectively, you need to include a disability lens.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We hope we answered your questions in the chat as we went along, but if not, or even if we did, and you'd like to continue the conversation, please join us later today in a video room for the speaker after chat. We look forward to connecting with you then. And like Ryan said, if you are an Exponent member and would like additional support in learning about disability, disability inclusion, disability justice, all of the above, please consider joining Exponent Philanthropy's Disability Funders Peer Circle. And you can reach out to me or to Ryan and we can get you connected to the group.
Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Jesse, Nikki, and Ryan. I really appreciated each of you sharing your work and key takeaways. So thank you again for this discussion. To the listeners, please complete the evaluation under this window. Thank you for being part of the conversation today.